Okay, thank you for that introduction, even though I'm a little bit late on that. So I'm going to be presenting Facebook in Venezuela, Understanding Solidarity Economies in Low Trust Environments on behalf of our team at Georgia Tech. So I want to kick off this presentation by telling you a story about one of our participants named Santiago. Santiago is a 32-year-old Venezuelan and expectant father. He told us that in the 5 months after his partner became pregnant, he was able to trade successfully on Facebook groups for diapers. So he was able to trade things like flour and sugar in exchange for those diapers. While it isn't enough, it is a start. And he explained that diapers were really difficult to get in Venezuela, especially at a reasonable price. But he told us that Facebook groups was absolutely the best method for finding those diapers because of his ability to identify equitable trades. He was able to do this despite the tough competition and the potential to run into scammers on Facebook groups. He told us that members had to be careful because some people take advantage of others in the current economic climate in Venezuela. Sorry. So I want to give you a little bit of context into what's going on in Venezuela right now. So by show of hands, how many of you are up on the news and know what's going on? Okay, so a lot of you. But for those of you who don't, I'll give you a little bit of an explanation. So Venezuela is run by a socialist government and has been for quite some time. And what they've done to be able to fund that government is to rely primarily on their export of crude oil. And so they import everything else, including food and medicine. And then they have a nationalized distribution of that food and medicine. And they set prices and send it out to very specific stores. But what's happened since the price of crude oil collapsed in 2014, they've not been able to import enough food and medicine for everybody in the country. And as a result, Venezuelans have on average lost about 20 pounds each involuntarily over the last couple of years. And in addition to that, they have hyperinflation, and so prices are changing absolutely every single day. The amount of money you actually need to buy something is quite high. So for example, if you were to go out to a bar and you wanted to order a beer, you would need about a stack of money this big to be able to get that beer. And so it's a very complicated, very confusing scenario for Venezuelans right now. And so what they've done, rather than using money, Venezuelans have turned primarily to bartering, and that happens both in the offline setting and the online setting. And so what we wanted to look at was the online setting and how this was happening on Facebook groups. And so they're trading things like medicine, food, and basic staples such as diapers, like I mentioned in the story of Santiago. And we know that this happens pretty much two different ways. Either you are finding people who want to trade equitably with you, so who are valuing the human being over capital gains, which is what we call a solidarity economy, or you're running into something called a bartero, which you can think of as just like a scammer. And so that scammer is putting their personal interests and economic gains over the group. And in Venezuelan Spanish, a bartero is actually named after an ant. And it's this ant that has these scorch the earth tactics, and it goes out and collects all this stuff in the environment and brings it back to the colony, even though they don't need it. So that's where they get the name from. And in our research, we looked primarily at the design affordances of Facebook groups. So I wanted to give you just an overview quickly of what Facebook groups look like and what an average post might look like. So as you can see over here, this is a sample Venezuelan bartering group. This is pretty common. So you will see truque up at the top means bartering, anti-bartero is like anti-scammer. In the center, you see that there's all these different items for sale. On the side, you see that there's members and there's a description of the group. It'll provide a location. And this is a pretty typical sample bartering post. So somebody will put up an image of the item that they want to trade. In this one, we see that there's toothpaste, which is a really difficult item to come by. And it says that, you know, we'll change the toothpaste for rice and like a 1-to-1 ratio. So this is actually a pretty fair post in terms of how these posts go, and I'll talk to you a little bit more about that in a second. So we wanted to know, how can we design and support solidarity economies as social computing systems? And furthermore, what factors must be considered in an infrastructure which is permeated by anti-solidarity values, such as in Venezuela? So for our study, we were able to speak with 21 participants. 19 of them were from 3 Facebook bartering groups in the same city, and they were from different sized groups. So one of the groups was quite large at 45,000, another at 8,000, and another at just about 1,500. So we used semi-structured interviews and did observations of these groups, and then used thematic analysis to uncover patterns in our transcripts. So this paper is fairly dense if you want to read it, so I'm going to give you kind of the 10,000 foot overview of some of our findings and then talk about some design implications afterward. So what we found is that Venezuela is a very low trust environment. So these online Facebook bartering groups are not operating outside of the underlying infrastructure, and they can't. So even if a group is trying to form a solidarity economy, you're going to be dealing with these bachaqueros. There's just no getting around it. But they do seek out these solidarity networks and are really trying hard to make them work. And I'm going to be talking more in depth about 2 of our findings. One of them is on supporting solidarity economies on Facebook. So some of the design affordances that are really helping these solidarity economies function. And then some of the anti-solidarity behavior and those design affordances on Facebook that aren't necessarily supporting bachaqueros, but also aren't really stopping them either. Okay, so some of the design affordances of Facebook groups that are helping the solidarity economies, I've got them organized in kind of 3 major buckets, and I'll walk you through each one of them and give some examples. So the Venezuelan bartering groups have appropriated Facebook groups for their purposes. Facebook was absolutely not designed to support a solidarity economy in a low-trust environment like Venezuela. But they do certain things like putting anti-bachaquero in the title, which allows them to ward off offenders, and they felt that that was fairly effective. They also have the ability to create their own rules. So of the 3 groups that we studied, each one of them had rules that were unique to their group. And they're also able to have content that's unique to each trading group. So for example, there are groups that are dedicated to anti-contraceptives, and there are other ones that are dedicated to baby items like diapers and formula. In terms of governance, the Facebook group structure has administrators, moderators, and members. And these roles are absolutely not mutually exclusive. So members feel that they play an important role in upholding values of the groups, and they certainly do. A lot of members weren't even aware that leadership existed. They felt it was their duty to call out when people were not behaving by the rules that were established in the group, or if they felt somebody was posting something at an unfair price. And then finally, communication and coordination on Facebook does help support these solidarity economies. So there is an option to start a conversation or to sell something when they're posting in those Facebook groups. And they're able to use these to seek information. So for example, if you are not able to find a medication that you desperately need, you're able to go onto Facebook groups to ask people, have you seen this in another group? Where was the last place you saw this in the offline world? Help me direct me to this place where I can find it. And they felt that that was quite helpful. There's also a lot of flexibility in deciding with whom somebody wants to trade. So we saw that there was 2 main methods. So a lot of people went with first come, first served basis. So if you're the first person to respond to my post, I'm going to trade with you. Whereas others would kind of filter through and decide, okay, I wanted sugar for this, but I also need flour, so maybe I'll go with the person who offered me flour because they're offering me more. And then there was also the ability to coordinate through Facebook Messenger to organize a place to meet up and to do some additional negotiating. And finally, there's very low barriers to group access, which can be essential. So for example, one of our participants was a nurse, and she told us about a man who was stabbed 15 times. And hospitals there, because there are no medical supplies, had no sutures. And this man had to go onto Facebook groups to find the sutures to bring them to the hospital to get the care that he needed. And because these are typically public groups, he was able to do that fairly quickly. Okay, so there's a lot of things about Facebook groups that are not supporting the solidarity economies. And this is where we talk about those anti-solidarity behaviors of the bachaqueros. So bachaqueros, even if it does say anti-bachaquero, they infiltrate the solidarity economy spaces. And even if somebody is not intending to be a bachaquero, it's very likely that they're engaging in bachaquero practices. So for example, if you go to a grocery store in Venezuela, you're probably going to have to wait in line for about 8 hours. When you get into the store, you might get 2 of the 10 things that you need. And rather than walking out with just, one of each of those 2 items that you do find, you're going to buy everything that's there so you can trade it later. And this is technically considered a bachaquero behavior. It's also difficult to tell who's actually running these groups. In fact, one of our administrators was running a group underneath a pseudonym because the group had turned on him after he posted something at too high of a price. So he pretended to hand over the reins to this other person, which was actually him. So there's not a lot of transparency. And so bachaqueros really capitalize on that lack of transparency. So it's really difficult to locate rules. They put them underneath the description section. People don't know where they are. You typically don't know what a rule is until you break it. It's also really difficult to understand what a fair price is because you're bartering. And furthermore, because the prices are changing every day, nobody really knows what a fair price is. So there's also a lot of violations, and even if the administrators are doing their best to uphold a solidarity economy, there are absolutely no tools for them to be able to track those offenses. So at best, they're going into Facebook Messenger and talking about people who are committing offenses, and if that person happens to commit them in rapid succession, then they'll kick them out. So that's if they have a rule that says you can break the rules more than once, but a lot of people, it's first strike and you're out. And then there's also a lot of insecurity regarding member identity. So there's nothing that says that a bachaquero can't just keep creating new profiles to trade with people. There's no history on Facebook profiles of whether or not you're a trustworthy human being. So people expressed a lot of fear. And that was, to their health and safety. So people unanimously that we interviewed said that they were physically afraid to go do these trades, but they had to. And none of our participants actually experienced any physical harm, but they had heard stories of it happening to other people. What did happen to our participants were things like trade cancellations, which were really disheartening, especially if they needed medication. Also, price gouging was really common, but very often people would pay it, especially for medicine. So if your son had asthma, which one of our participants did, they would pay pretty much anything to get medication for their child. And then finally, fake products were very prominent. So there were some that new people to the groups were likely to fall for, such as carrots being stuffed in a toothpaste tube and not checking it before they left. But there were some that which were much more difficult to detect, such as baby formula, which had been cut with lime. There was really no way to figure that out until an infant was hurt. So we know that there are some design affordances which work and do not work for the Venezuelan bartering groups on Facebook. So we took these findings and compared them to COLIC's design principles for online communities. COLIC acknowledges that there is no one formula for designing effective online communities for cooperation and collective action. Instead, he provides a list of design principles that were based largely on the work by Axelrod and Ostrom. And so this slide presents a list of those principles, and to some degree, Venezuelan bartering groups violate most of them. For example, like I've mentioned before, there's the inability to identify one another. And furthermore, one of the other principles COLIC suggests is to have moderate scarcity, but Venezuela is operating in extreme scarcity. And yet, Venezuelan solidarity economies, which have emerged on Facebook, have been relatively successful, despite appropriating the platform, which was not designed to support this activity. However, this may not be surprising, as areas such as crisis informatics have shown that in lieu of software features, determination, resilience, and human ingenuity find a way to appropriate platforms to accomplish this goal. So looking at these design principles, we came up with a few suggestions of how we might be able to better design for solidarity economies and low-trust environments. And I'll go over these quickly because I'm running out of time. So prominent rule placement, buyer and seller reviews, tools for tracking offenses and graduated sanctions, and an equitable marketplace. So where does this leave us? So when Mark Zuckerberg first created a social site for college students at elite universities in 2004, he couldn't have anticipated that just over a decade later, his platform would play a significant role in basic survival for individuals in a prolonged economic crisis thousands of miles away in South America. It's a tribute to human ingenuity and resilience that software tools can be repurposed this way. Analysis of the strengths and weaknesses of Facebook groups for the purpose of bartering in extreme scarcity suggests a host of simple modifications that can make them work significantly better. There may be a viable economic model to motivate the software development if Facebook wishes to compete with marketplace-oriented sites, or it could be undertaken as a humanitarian effort. More broadly, providing users with more powerful, general-purpose, customizable tools can help empower people in this crisis and crises of the future to help craft solutions for themselves. Thank you.
Hi, Morn, I'm on Cornell Tech. Heartbreaking situation and really great work here. And I want to give you a chance to go back to your design implications and also ask that, particularly, it sounds like you're trying to justify it for Facebook. It sounds like some of these design recommendations are useful for any general buy and sell group, not necessarily in low trust environments. So can you talk a little bit about those?
Yeah, absolutely. So this certainly extends beyond Facebook. We were looking at it for Facebook groups, but certainly implications could work elsewhere. And with the design implications, these are things that we've seen work in other areas. So for example, prominent role placement, that's something that works very well on Reddit, and equitable marketplaces. We know that that works really well in like StubHub, so showing what tickets are selling for in different locations. Same thing with buyer and seller reviews. If you look at eBay and Amazon, they're present there. So they're just working on other platforms, but certainly on Facebook or on other social media platforms where solidarity economies may appear, these design implications could be utilized.
Hi, excellent presentation. I was recently in Zimbabwe interviewing some activists who have kind of had to move from medium to medium over the course of their lifespan. So, you know, they had this huge SMS mailing list and they've had to move over to WhatsApp, which has terrible affordances for their work. There are lots of WhatsApp groups that are oriented around knowing where police blocks are, things like that. Are you planning to do other studies in other types of low trust environments just to see, you know, if they correlate or not?
That's something that we've thought about. At this time, we don't have specific plans, but we were interested in seeing, you know, a low trust environment in Venezuela might very well be different than a low trust environment in Zimbabwe or somewhere else in Africa or India or China. So it's certainly worth looking at to see if these design implications could be moved somewhere else or how they might have to be adjusted for different cultures.
Yeah, or an academic department.
That too.
Any other questions? I actually have one.
Yeah.
Why did you choose Facebook, and why are people not actually using some of these other marketplaces that already do some of these designs that you were talking about?
Sure. So Venezuelans do actually use some other platforms, but the majority of the activity happens on Facebook groups, and they're one of the highest users of Facebook. And so there's a very high percentage of users in the country. They did use WhatsApp, but that was for much smaller groups, so Facebook provided very wide access given the presence of the platform in the country. Thank you again.
Thank you.